She was 27 years old. She was a school teacher, the kind former students still describe decades later without a single unkind word to add. On the night of August 26, 1981, in Beckley, West Virginia, her fiancé came home and found her shot 4 times in the head and shoulder inside her own house, on the eve of their wedding, in the same home where wedding gifts were likely still sitting wrapped somewhere nearby. That is not a story about a robbery gone wrong or a stranger passing through town. That is a story about a killer who let a police officer bury the woman he loved, raise questions no one could answer, and grow old without ever facing a courtroom for it. And it would take almost 40 years. A task force that treated the file as still burning rather than cold. And a prison interview 1,100 miles away in California to finally put a name to the man Raleigh County had been quietly suspecting since the very beginning. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to a wedding that never happened. Because to understand what Beckley lost that August night, you first have to understand who Cynthia Miller was. Beckley, West Virginia, in 1981, was coal country trying to hold itself together through a decade that hadn't been kind to southern West Virginia. Mines cutting shifts, young families deciding whether to stay or leave for work elsewhere. A close-knit town where a schoolteacher's wedding was the kind of news that traveled fast and warmly through every classroom and church pew in the county. It was the last summer before MTV would change what teenagers listened to. Rotary phones still hanging in most kitchens. A town small enough that everybody's cousin either taught school, worked in law enforcement, or had a brother down in the mines. Cynthia Jane Miller taught in Raleigh County, and by every account anyone has ever given about her, she was exactly the kind of teacher a town remembers for generations. The kind whose former students still bring her up unprompted, decades later. I've not heard a crossword or a bad thing about Cynthia Miller. A Beckley police detective would say decades afterward. She was just such a good, clean, honest, innocent victim. Her sister, Diana Jones, would later describe her simply as very talented, the kind of quiet, specific praise that says more than a paragraph of eulogy ever could. Cynthia was engaged to Gary O'Neill, a police officer with the Leicester Police Department, and their wedding was set for August 27, 1981, a Thursday that the whole town understood as a celebration waiting to happen. The kind of wedding where half of Raleigh County would probably show up whether they'd been formally invited or not. Cynthia had built a life that by every visible measure was about to get even better. A fiancé who wore a badge himself and understood exactly what kind of life she was signing up for. A classroom full of students who adored her. A wedding dress presumably already hanging in a closet somewhere, waiting. Beckley in 1981 was the kind of place where a young engaged schoolteacher could reasonably believe the biggest event on her calendar that week was a wedding, not a funeral. Cynthia believed that too. She had no way of knowing that the night before her wedding would be the last night of her life. On the evening of August 26, 1981, someone entered Cynthia Miller's home on Miller Street in Beckley and shot her 4 times, in the head and shoulder. It was Gary O'Neill, her fiancé, a working police officer himself, who came home and found her. The exact scene a groom should never have to walk into the night before his own wedding. Trained or not, badge or not. There were no immediate signs pointing to a stranger passing through, no obvious break-in that fit the story of a random crime, no easy explanation that would let the community simply blame bad luck and move on. Beckley police responded immediately, and in the days that followed, investigators developed leads, conducted interviews, and worked the case with the urgency any brutal murder of a well-loved young teacher would demand in a town that size, where everyone seemed to know Cynthia personally, or knew someone who did. Where the wedding invitations that were never used likely sat in drawers for years afterward, as a quiet, private reminder. But 1981 offered detectives painfully few tools to close the distance between a strong hunch and a chargeable case. There was no DNA testing available yet anywhere in criminal investigation. That technology wouldn't touch an American courtroom for years, and West Virginia's own first DNA case wouldn't be tried until 1989, 8 years after Cynthia's death. Without forensic science to lean on, and without anyone willing or able to talk, the leads that seemed promising in the first weeks slowly went quiet. One by one, the way leads in even the most urgent investigations sometimes do when there's no physical evidence strong enough to force a confession or secure a warrant. The case that would haunt Beckley for the next 4 decades went cold with the killer's identity already, perhaps, sitting somewhere just out of reach the entire time. The years that followed asked a devastating question of everyone who had loved Cynthia Miller. How do you keep living in a small town when the person responsible for a murder this senseless might still be walking its streets, might still be someone you pass at the grocery store or nod to at church without ever knowing? Beckley police detectives, according to Raleigh County's own prosecutor decades later, never actually let the file go cold in the way the word usually implies. I always call them simmering cases, prosecutor Kristen Keller would say. They're never really cold. Those original detectives are still around, and I've worked with them for many years. They never forgot the murder of Cynthia Miller, and it haunted them. It's a striking admission. An entire generation of investigators carrying one unsolved case personally, quietly, for the whole of their careers, long after retirement, long after anyone outside the department would have assumed it was forgotten. 1985 became 1990. 1990 became 2000, nearly 2 decades since that August night, and Cynthia's case remained open on paper, revisited periodically whenever a new lead surfaced or an old witness resurfaced, but without the single break that could finally move it forward into an actual courtroom. 2000 became 2010. And the case had now outlived an entire generation of technology that hadn't existed when Cynthia died. DNA testing had become standard practice everywhere in American law enforcement by then. Genetic databases were growing by the year. And still, Cynthia Miller's file sat exactly where it had for 3 decades, its answer apparently requiring something other than forensic science alone to finally surface. Cynthia's sister, Diana Jones, carried the loss of her sister through all those decades, remembering a woman she described simply as very talented and deeply loved by the students she taught. A version of Cynthia frozen permanently at 27, never allowed to grow older, never allowed to become the wife or the veteran teacher or the aunt she should have gotten to be. Gary O'Neill, the fiancé who found her, lived the rest of his own life carrying that image from that August night. A burden he would carry, in the end, until his own death. Never getting to see anyone charged with taking his fiancée from him. Never getting the closure that would eventually, decades too late for him personally, finally reach Cynthia's family. If you've ever wondered what it takes for a nearly 40-year-old murder to finally move again, the honest answer is, sometimes it just takes a department deciding, without any single dramatic new clue, that the file deserves one more determined look. And if that kind of quiet, decades-long persistence is the kind of story that moves you, consider subscribing, because that's exactly the kind of case this channel exists to tell. In 2017, the Beckley Police Department put together a dedicated cold case task force and pulled in the West Virginia State Police to join the effort, treating decades-old unsolved homicides as an active priority rather than a permanent write-off. Cynthia Miller's murder was one of the very first cases the newly formed team picked up, a sign of how central her case had remained to the department's own sense of unfinished business, even 36 years on. Detective Sergeant Morgan Bragg and Lieutenant C. Bledsoe eventually traveled over 1,000 miles from Beckley to the Sierra Conservation Center in Jamestown, California, to sit down with a man named Earl James Robbins, already incarcerated there on unrelated charges of sexual assault and assault with a deadly weapon. A man who had lived in southern West Virginia decades earlier before eventually landing on the other side of the country. What was said in that prison interview room has never been fully made public, and investigators have been careful about what they reveal even now. But Robbins himself would later write, in a letter sent directly to the Raleigh County Circuit Court, that detectives had come to question him specifically about who possibly killed Cynthia Jane Miller, and that he'd told them what he believed at the time, insisting he had no further information beyond his own theory. Investigators, working methodically over the years that followed and describing the process as being like following a spider web, one witness leads to another witness, continued building whatever case they could construct from decades-old memories, decades-old relationships, and whatever physical evidence had actually survived that long. On Tuesday, October 13th, 2020, 39 years after that August night, the Raleigh County Prosecuting Attorney's Office announced that a grand jury had indicted Earl James Robbins, then 64 years old, on first-degree murder in the death of Cynthia Miller, along with a charge for illegal use of a firearm in her death. The same grand jury also indicted him separately for an October 1980 kidnapping, abduction, and first-degree sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl in Beckley, a case investigators said had come to light during the same renewed investigation. Though prosecutors would not say publicly whether the two cases were connected or whether Robbins and Miller had ever known each other personally. By law, grand jury proceedings are confidential, Keller explained, visibly constrained in what she could reveal about exactly what evidence had finally moved the case forward after so many silent years, even as reporters pressed for more. Diana Jones, Cynthia's sister, spoke to a local news station the same day the indictment became public, recalling once more the sister she'd lost, the talented, beloved teacher whose murder had shaped the rest of her own life just as much as it had shaped Beckley's, a loss she'd carried quietly for 39 years without ever expecting to hear a name attached to it. On November 12, 2020, Robbins appeared by video from his California prison cell for arraignment in front of Judge Poling, pleading not guilty to all 5 charges against him. In a letter he sent to the court around that same time, Robbins wrote that he intended to fight extradition and demand a trial somewhere other than Raleigh County, insisting he had only ever offered detectives his own theory about who might have killed Cynthia, never a confession, and that he planned to pursue his own legal action against the Beckley Police Department over what he called slander and defamation. Prosecutors began the formal extradition process required to bring him back to West Virginia to stand trial, filing what's known as a detainer with California authorities to ensure he would remain in custody once his current sentence there concluded. As of the most recent public reporting, that process remained underway, Beckley and Raleigh County still waiting 4 decades after Cynthia Miller's wedding day never happened, for the trial that would finally test the case against him in open court. A trial that could still be years away given the complexity of extraditing a man already serving time on the opposite side of the country. There is a particular kind of justice in a case like Cynthia Miller's, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It is not the tidy justice of a verdict already delivered, the kind so many cold case stories are able to end with. It's the slower, harder kind, a department refusing to let a case go permanently cold for 39 years, a prosecutor calling it simmering rather than dead, an indictment finally naming a man who may still spend years fighting extradition before any jury hears the evidence against him. It's a sister who has waited 4 decades for an answer, and who still doesn't yet have the finality of a trial, let alone a verdict. It's the uncomfortable truth that in cases this old, an indictment is a beginning, not an ending. The start of a legal process that may take years more before anyone can say with certainty what a court will ultimately decide. It's worth naming, too, exactly what makes this case different from so many others in this genre. There is no Dynamatch here, no dramatic genetic genealogy breakthrough, no forensic lab report unveiled at a triumphant press conference. What moved this case forward, as far as the public record shows, was almost entirely old-fashioned investigative work. A task force formed in 2017. A decision to travel across the country to sit down with a man already behind bars for other crimes. A slow accumulation of witnesses and statements built one conversation at a time. It is a reminder that not every cold case gets cracked by a laboratory. Some get cracked because a detective simply refuses to stop asking the same question a different way, year after year, until someone finally answers it differently than they had before. Picture Cynthia Miller not as a name in a cold case file, and not as the subject of a 2020 grand jury indictment still working its way through the extradition process, but as the teacher her own community still describes without a single unkind word attached. Talented, kind. The sort of person a police detective, 40 years removed from the case, still calls clean, honest, and innocent without a moment's hesitation. That is the woman Beckley lost the night before her wedding. The version of her that this case, however slowly, is still working to honor. What should we take from a story like Cynthia's? Maybe it's that cold case is sometimes the wrong word entirely, that a murder can sit unresolved for decades, while the people who worked it never actually let it go, calling it simmering instead of dead, carrying it personally long after their own retirements. Maybe it's that justice, in cases this old, often arrives in stages rather than all at once, an indictment first, an extradition fight next. A trial somewhere further down a road nobody can promise will be short or certain. Maybe it's a reminder that the detectives who refuse to forget a name, even years after everyone else has moved on to newer cases, are sometimes the entire reason a family eventually gets an answer at all, even if that answer takes decades longer than anyone should have had to wait. Would this case have ever moved again without a 2017 task force deciding Cynthia Miller's file deserved a second look after 36 years of silence? How many other small-town murders are sitting exactly where this one sat for so long, not forgotten by the detectives who worked them, but still waiting for the specific combination of persistence, funding, and circumstance that finally breaks a case open? And what does justice mean for a family in the years between an indictment and a trial, caught in the space between finally having a name and still not having a verdict, still not knowing how a jury might eventually rule? Cynthia Miller never got her wedding day. Her fiancé, Gary O'Neill, never got to see anyone answer for what happened to her before his own death years later. But nearly 4 decades later, her sister finally has a name attached to an indictment, and a Raleigh County community that never stopped believing this case still mattered finally has a defendant facing charges in open court, even as the extradition process continues to unfold. The trial that will determine what happens next has not yet been written, and may still be a long way off. But the silence that swallowed Cynthia Miller's case for 39 years finally, undeniably, has been broken. If this case stayed with you, that's exactly the point. Say her name, Cynthia Miller, in the comments below. And if there's a cold case in your own community that detectives still quietly consider simmering rather than dead, don't let it stay quiet either.